Hi, Professor Brown. You have the privilege of being part of episode 1 of the Juanita and Marie podcast.
Hello.
Juanita, what are we covering today, Juanita?
We are covering number 4 on the quiz. I'm sorry, on the final, which has to do with the consent decree, the CPS consent decree from 1980. And we'll go through a timeline of sorts, and then talk about, and then end with whether or not CPS has achieved unitary status.
So as we know, 1963, there was a boycott in Chicago, and it focused on the people focused on the inequalities that were in Chicago public schools. Over 200,000 students in Chicago joined. I thought that this was a really cool picture of recruiting for the movement. And then you see the Daily Defender, Freedom Day, thousands march here. There's the 63 boycott video that we watched, and also another picture from Zinn Education would put Willis out without a doubt. So we're going to talk about the Chicago Board of Education, the U.S. Department of Justice Consent Decree of 1980. And what this meant was that the Board of Education of the City of Chicago had engaged in acts of discrimination in an assignment of students, and also system-wide effective segregation of students on a racial and ethnic basis. I looked a little into what was going on in the political climate at this time, and Jimmy Carter was the president, which to me signified that there were a lot more progressive and radical changes that were happening. And as we know, Reagan comes in later and undoes absolutely every piece of it. But this was a big part of what was happening in the 80s. So the consent decree complaint alleged that Chicago public schools engaged in practices that promoted inequalities and in the yellow, you see these are going to focus on boundaries, and then the other two are more culture and climate. So drawn attendance zone boundaries, allowing racially segregated intra-district transfers by white students, maintaining severely overcrowded and educationally inferior schools for African-American students and less crowded schools for white students, adjusting grade structures of schools in racially and ethnically segregated ways, and assigning teachers and staff to schools in racially segregated ways. So there are 4 basic objectives: to desegregate schools, number 1, greatest practicable number of stably desegregated schools. So definitely putting in that language that says that it has to be practical and pragmatic. Compensatory programs in schools remaining segregated. So make sure you provide educational and related programs for any Black or Hispanic schools remaining segregated. There had to be participation and provide for desegregation of all racial and ethnic groups. And this is where it really puts the emphasis that there is racial and ethnic segregation. And then finally, fair allocation of burdens. So the burdens of desegregation are not imposed arbitrarily on any racial or ethnic group. There were some voluntary and mandatory techniques, just highlighting a few of them. Some voluntary ones were magnet schools that enhanced desegregation, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. That meant if magnet schools or other voluntary techniques were used, they would contain racial and ethnic goals and management controls. And so race was definitely a component for the magnet schools. Other mandatory techniques were redrawn attendance areas, and then mandatory reassignment and transportation at the board expense. And in some of the articles that we read, the major clashes that there were students being bused, and then also the administration when they had to work in different neighborhoods or entirely different schools. There was a Black principal who said that when she went to show up to her first day at a predominantly white school, she was met with the KKK, she was met with Nazi signage, and that it was terrifying.
And so here we have a timeline. It gives you the history of the Chicago public schools as of 1980. So in 1980, just like Marie explained, right, the Chicago Board of Education and the Justice Department signed a desegregation consent decree. And then we move to 1988, where the Illinois legislature passes the Chicago School Reform Act. And what that meant was that it created local school councils and began this era of reform. And this was under, and what spearheaded this effort, or the person who spearheaded this effort was the late Harold Washington. In 1995, we have the GOP, so now we have a Republican that's in office, and he passes the Chicago School Reform Amendatory Act, reversing the decentralization ushered in the 1988 Reform Act. Now, you still keep the LSCs, right? Now, there's mandatory training for them. However, what happens here is the superintendent is replaced by a CEO. The mayor now has the power to appoint a school board members. It also trims bargaining rights, and the mayor can strengthen accountability measures. In 1996, Vallis Daly's appointed CEO places 109 schools on academic probation. And the state legislature also passes the Illinois Charter School Law. So also in 96, the school board approves new student promotion policies based on test scores. And just a side note, my brother was slated to graduate 8th grade. In fact, he graduated 8th grade on stage, and then days later learned that he would have to repeat 8th grade because of policies like this. The state legislature, when they passed the Illinois school law, it designated, allow for 15 schools in Chicago, 15 schools in the suburbs, and 15 charter schools in downstate. In 97, Vallis selects 14 neighborhood schools to join Lincoln Park High School in IB organizations, and the first charter schools open, including YCCS, which is the charter school that most of the students in your class work for. In 2000, CPS raises the bar for academic probation with low scoring schools. And so what that means is that it's just another sort of get tough strategy with low scoring schools. And it's another intervention that's later abandoned because this is not working. The schools are not improving. In 2002, we see No Child Left Behind. And this requires states to show steady student progress. In 2004, Mayor Daley announces the Renaissance 2010 plan, Renaissance 2010, and his plan to close dozens of poorly performing schools and create 100 new ones, most of them charter and contract schools by 2010. And activists and parents citywide were not having it, and there was protest around this effort. In 2006, Rob Blagojevich signs a new universal preschool law, offering free state-funded preschool in principle to all Illinois children, regardless of family income. In 2007, CPS is approaching their Renaissance 2010 goal, but neighborhoods identified as most in need had not gotten them. And then in 2009, you have a new charter law, or it's amended, and it increases the charter cap to 120, allowing for 70 schools in Chicago. And what this does, in essence, is hastening this process of these 100 schools that need to be open, or that were promised in the Renaissance 2010. Also, Obama enacts the Race to the Top initiative. And so one of the things that the Race to the Top initiative did was it allotted over $4 billion for states to meet the ambitions of new teacher evaluation requirements. But with the opening of the new charter schools, or allowing for the allotment of more charter schools, there is a requirement that 50% of the teachers in the Chicago charter schools have to be certified. And then by the school's fourth year of being open, 75% of the teachers need to be certified. And this all happening, right? So here you have an increase in the number of charter schools, right? We're coming to the close of the Renaissance 2010 Act, and the consent decree is lifted this same year. And so you have a consent decree that is lifted, and then you have more schools saying, hey, these are schools that are being open. We have a plan. It's almost like they conspired for this to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then we have in 2012, CPS lengthens the elementary school day to 7 hours and the high school day to 7.5 hours. And CPS has one of the shortest school days in the nation. In 2013, CPS switches to student-based budgeting, which provides a certain amount of money for every student enrolled at the school. And the way they used to fund the schools was by paying by teaching positions at the school. And so this forced principals to make cuts at their schools. The same year was a really tragic one in the city of Chicago, as Rahm Emanuel and CPS closed 49 elementary schools, forcing students to have to travel miles from their homes to go to schools, to go to new schools. It put 3,000 teachers out of jobs, and really also allowed for more charter schools to come into neighborhoods, especially into poor neighborhoods, to replace those CPS schools that were closed. And, and I would even argue that these charter schools, what they did was take the students from the public schools. And so here you have a number of schools in some in the same community that are under enrolled, while you have a charter school whose numbers are increasing. And then here we are in 2020, and CPS is currently threatening to close 3 underfunded and under-enrolled elementary schools in the West Side. They put that plan on pause for now because families aren't having it, community activists aren't having it, and so we shall wait to see what happens.
And just to add to that, Juanita, in 2013 and in 2012, there was a lot of activism and protest of the closing of the schools. And so, 1963 really set precedent for people being able to rise up. And we, like you said, in 2020, we're still seeing that.
Yeah, and I think also when we have the Chicago Teachers Union president, Karen Lewis, come in, I think that she paved the way for this new sort of activism within the Chicago Teachers Union,
Hmm.
um, which was good, right? Because they needed that advocacy work to happen from within the union. And so, like what we see today is are the changes that Karen Lewis started in the CTU when she first came in.
That's right. So we're going to talk about redlining a little bit, plus the school choice, which equals segregation. And the I want to mention Milliken versus Bradley because the biggest difference between the consent decree and Milliken versus Bradley is that the consent decree in Chicago really addresses the location and what was happening where people live as a cause of segregation. And so it says there are these boundaries that are within Chicago. Even if there is white flight, there's this segregation still happening in Chicago. And I believe the language that they use is racial isolation. And so you're seeing pockets of people of the same race in certain communities. So in this image, you can see the map of redlining. So here you see green is best, purple or blue is still desirable, C is definitely declining, and D is hazardous. And so this is what people believed and what people were working with. There's an image where a family is dealing with neighborhood terrorists who are destroying their homes and trying to scare them away from living in the neighborhood. And then also in the bottom corner, you see people who are uh, again protesting and for or against redlining.
And so even when you
Development.
have families, right, that could afford, right, to live in a more affluent neighborhood, they're not able to because they're terrorized and sometimes forced to move out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if they are able to purchase, they're often, redlining is purchasing on contract. And so you see these are the areas, the red areas, where people are forced to purchase on contract and unfair contracts and contracts that say if you miss one payment, then we can take your house back, and showing up, dumping all their stuff on the street, and people have to relocate. And so there is no wonder that there's instability in places where there's redlining.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to go from 2009 into the present because a lot of changes happened in because of the consent decree and then since 2009. I really quickly want to define the types of schools in CPS. So there's neighborhood schools, students live within their boundaries, and every student has a neighborhood school they can go to. It doesn't matter what tier you're in, and we'll talk about tiers in a little bit. Selective enrollment schools are for students from all across the city. Students have to apply. There's no guaranteed a seat no matter where they live, and most of the seats are filled through the tiered system. Magnet schools are in between. They admit students within their boundaries based on a lottery. Students then are based on a tier system, like a selective school. So nearby students aren't guaranteed a seat, but they have a better chance of getting in. And then finally, charter schools, which Juanita covered in the timeline. Yeah, I was going to say something. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that they get to, choose. It's like, so it's separate from what everyone else is sort of accustomed to, right? They
Mm-hmm.
come in and they change the rules for everyone,
Mm-hmm.
and just confuses the process.
And then the process is also long. And so we're going to go through, or Juanita's going to go through this, but that it isn't, there's no clear cut process. Like you have to know all this information we're telling you, like a seventh grader has to know, right? Because that's when they take the first test.
Yeah, so the selection process for magnet and selective enrollment schools, and so this is for high schools. So um, right now, what's interesting is that my family is going through this process. Right, I have a kid; he's in 8th grade, and the process started last year. Right, with its like you got to do good in these tests. You know, you have to be able to get into a magnet or actually a selective enrollment school, right? So once the consent decree was lifted, that meant that Chicago Public Schools no longer had to use race as as an admission requirement, right? They didn't have to look at race anymore. So what they did, they created a tier system, right? And so the policy was designed to ensure equal access and equity for students to enroll in these schools. And so what happens is they create this tier system. So depending on where it is that you live in the city, you will be granted some exceptions. Okay, so and they're looking at 5 social economic characteristics, right? They're looking at your median family income, percentage of single parent households, percentage of households where English is not the first language, percentage of homes occupied by the homeowner, and the level of adult education attainment. So I'm sorry, they're looking at that neighborhood wise, right? So the entire city, and they are saying, okay, this part of the city falls under tier 1 based on this criteria, this part of the city falls under tier 2. And so, and they have it color coded all throughout the map of the state, which, I mean, or the city, which we have on, I believe here, yeah. And so here on your right, in red, you see these are the students that would fall, if you live within these boundaries, then you would be considered to be in tier 1. And so then you will get special consideration. And so when it comes to the scoring, and so in order for you to attend a selective enrollment school, you need to have a composite score of 900 points. And the 900 points are determined by your grades. They're determined by your NWEA scores, so the standardized test that all elementary school students and CPS have to take, and by the selective enrollment test. Each are worth 300 points. And then the consideration that you get will decrease the amount of points that you need to enroll in that school. And it's all contingent on which area of the city you live in. And so if you live in the green, in the green tier, in the green or light green, that means that you live in a community that is more affluent, has more resources. You have 2-parent households. The median household income is higher than, you know, the average for the city. So if you go, Marie, do you want to explain the one on the left, the map on the left?
What about
that's the one that you talked about when we first began. Okay. Yeah, so I know that you had drew some correlations between the two.
Yeah, so what is interesting is, so we see that there's this red hazardous area and now it's green, and you know that this is directly because of gentrification, right? And we see that people move out or forced out due to the contracts, due to the redlining. And you also see that some areas have remained red, and that we, can still see if you are a tier 1, you are in a hazardous area. Like these colors have not changed. If you are tier 4, you are the best. And I think that was an interesting selection for CPS. For CPS and for, directly looking at redlining and applying it still. And, they were kind enough to say that tier 1 would be red versus tier 4, but you can still see the direct correlations. And how does a child feel when they know they're in a red area?
And so this is the calculator that they use, right? And so depending on the score here on the left-hand side, right underneath the title point calculator, right, you have the NWEA reading percentile. And so if you, thank you, Marie, if you score in the 47th percentile, then you get 47 points.
Mm.
Actually, that doesn't make any sense because then there's a total of 300 points that you get here. So depending on the percentile, so both of these, if you add the percentile scores for reading and math, you get your 157. And then your grades are A's are worth 75 points, B's are worth 50 points, and C's are worth 25. And so this here gives you a total of 225 points. And so in this case, I wanted to put the scores that my son currently has. And because we live in Humboldt Park, we fall under tier 2. Okay, so I just learned actually while putting this presentation together that they do shave off a few points depending on which tier you live in. So I did not know that until now. But so in order for Nasir to get into a selective enrollment school, he would have to get a perfect score on his oh, that's not right. He would have to get a perfect score to on his on the test, on the selective enrollment test. Actually, I just realized that some of these percentages are wrong, but it's okay, doesn't matter. And so if we look at here, so based on the NWA scores and based on the points that he has for his final grades, the last column here under 10 test points needed, this shows the score that he has to get in the selective enrollment test, the points based on his score. And so the maximum amount of points is 300. So even if he gets a perfect score on that selective enrollment test, he would only be able to go to what? One, two,
Two.
two.
And like what is a couple, right? And those schools all happen to be predominantly Black selective enrollment schools.
Yep. And in the South Side,
On the
right?
South Side. Mm-hmm.
It would make it really hard for me to get him to school, for him to get to school. And so it limits, even, this tier system doesn't help, right? So before the consent decree, we knew that, when the consent decree was in place, 35% of students in a school had to be white, right? That was the maximum. It was 35%. And in 2009, when the consent decree was lifted, we had 3 out of the 11 selective enrollment schools were majority white. Now, fast forward to 2020, we have 6 selective enrollment schools that are majority white. And so considering that, white students only make up 10%.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 10%. They make up, the majority of students in 6 of the 11 selective enrollment schools. And then like the other school, like some of them are majority Latino schools, and then you have your majority Black schools in the South Side.
And so just to compare exactly what Juanita's saying, so King College Prep is one of the schools Nasir would be able to get into, and you can see it's majority Black. And Northside College Prep is not a school he would be able to get into, even though they're both selective enrollment schools, and they were both created these tiers that was supposed to eliminate inequality, but this school has the 31% white students, and he isn't able to get in.
Mhm.
And so we want to review, has CPS met these consent decree objectives? So we can see, are schools desegregated? Absolutely not. No, they're not at all. And we're just looking at selective enrollment. I know that with public high schools, they're even more racially isolated than Northside. So Northside's, kind of close, but remember, white students make 10%, and here they are with 31%. We don't have that representation with Black students, right? Where's that 36%? And we don't have that representation with Hispanics, and we don't have that representation with that's equitable with Asian students.
So Marie, it's almost like safe to say that all the white kids, right, in CPS attend selective enrollment schools.
They must, because when we were looking at some of the numbers, like the top four on the north side were all around that 33% white students. And I can't do the math off the top of my head, but it would seem to be that almost nearly all 10% of those white students are in selective enrollment schools and not in their neighborhood schools.
Mm-hmm.
So the second one is compensatory programs and schools remain segregated. So we have talked about magnet, selective enrollment, charter schools, but there's so much room for growth. So we see North Side is less racially isolated than Kin College Prep. And so this is where we need to work on things. And North Side's not perfect at all. Is there participation? I don't remember the full statement. Hold on, let me look it up. Let's go back to slide 6.
I can read it to you.
I got it. There
Okay.
we go. To the greatest extent practicable, the plan will provide for desegregation of all the racial and ethnic groups. Absolutely not. We do not have any places that are desegregated. And then is there fair allocation of the burden? What do you think, Juanita?
Fair allocation is the burden of desegregation are not imposed arbitrarily on any racial or ethnic group. The plan shall ensure that the burdens of desegregation are not imposed arbitrarily on any racial or ethnic group. I mean, this has to do with, like, of course, systemic racism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, this, you are putting it on you are putting the burden on activists, right? Because activists are the ones that are on the streets, right? They're advocating for real school choice, right? And you have families and parents that are saying, hey, this is an unjust system, right? Like, my child deserves to go to the school that they want to go to, the school that interests them, right? And so no, you don't have white parents that are worried about the schools that their kids could go to, right? And so here you're putting the burden, on black families and on families of color. So no.
Mm-hmm. And I would also add that the people who benefit the most are still the white students, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have selective enrollment schools. They are a third white students, and it appears per the data that if you are a white student in Chicago, you're very likely to get into a selective enrollment school, despite if you were tier 4, despite if you were the best, right? Mm-hmm. You were once again empowered to be the best. Mm-hmm. So what does this say about the difference between real and legal definitions of equality regarding schools? I say a lot of it is politics, right? A lot of it is 2009 comes and we have Race to the Top, and Obama has solved the race issue in schools, when in reality,
and in the country, right?
And in the country, the whole entire country, there's no more racism. But in reality, things have gotten worse since 2009. And today, students are more racially isolated.
So it's real. I mean, it's by legal definition, maybe, but at that point in time when you were looking at it, right? So when you're looking at schools, I mean, and I don't think that we had enough time, right, to be able to look into the numbers of all the schools, right? And see how these schools are. But we know that these selective enrollment schools were mandated to have their schools to have a particular demographic. So at that point in time, yeah, maybe it could have been argued according to, you know, what was stated in that in the consent decree, that yes, maybe, you know, they have reached unitary status, right? But again, that was captured then. And then of course,
yeah, in reality, we have this
mhm,
versus what things should look like.
right.
If you want equality, then you want equal representation. But this is
Yes.
what we have instead.
And
Go ahead.
I was going to say, and in our list of suggestions,
We have the solutions.
we have the solutions. And you wanted to say something, Marie?
No, I was going to go right into this.
Okay, so housing and school choice are influenced by each other. So we have to analyze the current demographics and entrance process of Chicago public schools. So closing underperforming schools or schools that have been neglected by CPS, it forces families out of neighborhoods and adds to the housing and economic segregation in Chicago. We've seen that. We've seen it. I can speak to what I saw in Humboldt Park, right? And so you have three schools within, actually, no, yeah, three schools within, let's say, a 20-block radius. And maybe that's too much, but you know what? That's fine. You know, within a 20-block radius that close. And so then families have to make a decision. Am I going to travel? You know, one, am I going to take my kid to a charter school, right? And I'm not going to talk about charter schools right now, so I'm not going to give my opinion on that. But you make the decision whether you want to go to a charter school, right? That is open in the middle of all these three schools that just closed, or am I going to move somewhere that's more convenient for me, right? Because I have to go to work, you know, I have to take my kid to school, and I have to be able to get back, you know, or at least my kid needs to be able to get home safely from school, and they can't walk 10, 12 blocks to get home, right? And so this forces the families to leave. And so that what it does is also like accelerates, you know, city developers' plans and to gentrify communities. And so that's what's happened in Humboldt Park. You see a lot of families move out because what is there? You know, like if you have a family and you want them to go to a neighborhood school and you want them to go to a decent school, right? Because everybody wants a good education for their babies, you know, and if that's not available there, then you know what, then I need to move somewhere that's going to meet my immediate needs because I ain't got time to wait, right? So one of the ways that this could be resolved is that residential and economic segregation could be addressed and reversed if subsidized and public housing is proportionate to the number of low-income residents. And that's proportionate across the city's 77 neighborhoods. And so then you have school choice should not be dependent on economic capacity, acceptance, or location, but on the individual preference and academic interest of the student.
And something that we talked about regarding this is that this test, I had asked you, what was the test like? Like, was there a written component? And you said, no, it's just like read this paragraph, answer these questions, do these math problems. And so how do we, if we want to provide a sort of assessment for a school, that the assessment be about things that are rooted in identity, rooted in analysis, rooted in criticality, and that way you can have a better understanding of a child, right? And that it wouldn't just solely be based on a score and a checkbox and a tier based on a, you know,
your neighborhood,
a formula of the neighborhood that was really complicated when we looked at it. Like it looked at the census, and there's just so many layers of problems with how the formula is developed, and then how it's it changes people's lives and they don't even know it, right? Like so much of this I learned in this process. Did you want to add something else, Juanita?
No, you want to go
Uh,
ahead at that final point?
the final point, reverse the 1995 Chicago School Reform and Mandatory Act to remove ultimate power from the mayor and allow Chicago public schools to have an elected school board. When you, I mean, it's Chicago, but when you appoint people, it holds up to its Windy City name. And we have seen so many CEOs have come and gone along with their boards. And it's problematic because the people are not represented in the place where there's the most power to make these changes and to be reflective of what's happening. I would also argue that there should be more, actual educators in the place of power. And if I think you said this a little bit earlier, Juanita, is that just give the schools the money and let the schools make the choices that they know are best for them, instead of the mayor making all of the decisions.
Yep. Yep, because they don't know what to do with all that power.
Sure don't. And so in in light of an alternative assessment that we believe in, we hope you appreciated this presentation and podcast instead of just reading another analysis paper. And we both want to appreciate you for teaching us like really so much in this class.
Yes, thank you so much. It's much appreciated. And you mentioned that your goal was to teach us how to know how to look up law, how to reference it, and apply it to our vocation. And you did just that, and so it's much appreciated.
All right. Thank you, Professor Brown.
Bye-bye.
Bye.